And welcome to the Mailbox. This is a weekly segment where I look at some of the comments and questions that appear on various media, mostly YouTube, occasionally Twitter or from Patreon, and go through them with some more detailed answers than perhaps can or should be given on the platform itself. So the first one is from a patron, and it says, have you considered getting your Tuesday Talk, which is the sort of live discussion I do on all things Warcraft, minus Ret Paladins, on Tuesdays, listed on the weekly roundup page that Realm Maintenance does. What this is, it's a list of basically podcasts to grow your channel viewership. I'm not sure it's a really good thing to do. It's one of those things like, I think first of all, it's not a podcast. I think podcasts are really good, but what ultimately you've got with a podcast, because you are specifically doing it without visuals needed, even though some of them are really vodcast, but you really don't need the visuals. And you've got to have at least two people involved in them. One person alone, even responding to stuff in the chat, because there's always a delay in that anyway. I can imagine, and I know some of you do sort of listen to it as a podcast, but there's so many pauses in it that it doesn't have the same flow, I think, as a podcast. Even though some people are calling it that. So Bregvids, for example, he's someone who has just done a top 5 WoW podcasts, and he's very kindly put me into that list. So there are people I'm sure who do listen to that, but for me to sort of say it's a podcast, I don't think it's quite true. Not without heavy editing, and I'm not going through all that. I mean, I've just done a 5-minute video today, for example, for Patreon that will come up later on YouTube towards the end of next week. And that took me an hour to edit. Could you imagine how long it's going to take me to edit a 2-hour vlog, basically? So, no, I can't do that. But, you know, a podcast would be a great thing to do, but you do need two people, I think. I think that at least two. Some of them have more, of course. Now, so on to the YouTube sort of questions or statements. So there's one here about secondary stats. We're talking about the idea that now that you can get 200 gems of a secondary stat, that for some classes and specs, and my own included, there's some doubt as to whether you should have the 200 of your primary stat on there, because it might not be as good. And someone here saying they should be called secondary stats for a reason. They play way too much of a role and make way too much difference. Says the solution would be to add some secondary stats for classes that really need it to play properly, say haste for ret, blah, 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 but massively reduce the amount found on gear. I think with this, it is a tricky one. Obviously, the more stats you have in a game, doesn't matter what you call them, the more stats you have in a game, the more difficult it is to balance things. I mean, I think that's why some games like Star Wars The Old Republic very famously just went to having, I think they have basically 2 main stats now. And it's just basically because it's just far easier to balance that. The other thing is, I think ironically to do this, you can't have a situation where they do more but you have less on gear. You have to have a situation where there's actually far more on gear and it does less. Because if you have less on gear, then that means a certain amount of it has a major effect. So you would most definitely use gems of secondary stats over primary stats then. So what you need is for 200 of this secondary stat, to make it worth less than 200 of a primary stat, say strength, you've got to have the strength, ironically, be rarer and do more for a set amount of it. You know, that's the way you deal with that situation. If indeed it's a situation that needs dealing with. I think at the moment it is, because you have a situation where you can have as many secondary stat gems as you have sockets. There's no restriction there. But you can only have one primary stat gem. So that inherently tells you that this thing, it's rare, you're only allowed one, as if to be allowed more would be overpowered. So to now be in a situation where actually you don't want any at all, it's not as good, and I'm not saying that's the case for all classes and specs, but for some, because it's not as good, is just, it's totally at odds with that idea, isn't it? So I do think, it's one of these situations, I do very strongly get the impression that there is often not very good joined up thinking between different departments, because these things are always coming through where something just doesn't, people just don't consider certain consequences. So the consequence at the moment is a primary stat gem, which is supposed to be something you want, you're only allowed one, that is because it's so powerful, is no longer that powerful. Indeed, not powerful at all. So I do agree that something should be done, but I think it's the opposite of this one. I think you have to increase the effect of the primary stat and make that rarer if you're going to make the primary stat gem the thing you want to take. Next one, this is sort of lore-y based. There's a couple of comments here. The first one, I personally think you are right about the Naaru. This is what I've been talking about now, that the Naaru and the Void may... I'm only speculating here. I'm not saying this is what I think is the case. But maybe actually facets of the same thing. They're actually on the same side. It says, but the wrong way around. So one thing I keep hearing in WoW is balance. The Naaru say the light is the only way, but that's because they're fanatics, blah, 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 and the Void is the other. So the idea that they are opposed to each other. I mean, what I was initially proposing was a Babylon 5 type thing for those who are watching that. Or watching, it's been years ago, have seen it. That's an idea that we've got these two really high and ancient powers meddling in mortal races, and they're opposed to each other. They both sort of want the same thing in a way, but they have very different ways of going about it, which puts them not directly in conflict because they use the mortal races to fight out this conflict. And that's still the main idea I have. It's just, I came to the idea, I'll read, well, I came to the idea, before I put the next comment up, that I have no evidence, really, that the Naaru, by deed that is, that the Naaru are opposed to the Void. We know that the Naaru are opposed to the Legion. We know that the Void are opposed to the Legion. But what is there really, other than some implication, and no stronger than that, from a book, that the Naaru are actually opposed to the Void and the old gods and all that business? I'm now sort of thinking, not a lot, or indeed anything. So the next comment is, actually going by the books, and this is my next point, the Naaru and the Void are the opposites and are against each other. And it says the vision Zera gave to Illidan in his book was him in gold leading the fight against the Void, not the Legion. Not sure. Maybe. And was trying to force her prophecy. It's possible. But again, these prophecies, these things they put into the heads of the people that give these prophecies to, that in itself is how do we know that's not a motivator and not what their end goal is? Because this is going to come to a comment I'm going to talk about later with Alleria. But the other thing, coming back to the books, is going by the books. Yeah, the problem is that we're now in a situation where the books are split into two piles, effectively. One pile are all the books that have now been retconned and you might as well not bother reading. And the other pile may well be books that have yet to be retconned and still might not be, or take it with a pinch of salt at least. Blizzard have shown that they will not change minor points, but run roughshod over their own lore, which must be an absolute nightmare for lore nerds and people who are really, really into it, you know, because it's almost like you don't know anything anymore. They could change it at any time. Very difficult to say anything definitely. Next comment says, this is a sort of minor spoilery one. I'm not going to... Says, Magnus speaks to Argus and says it's not like Azeroth. That it sounds more tortured, and let's see what Argus wants to show us. I believe that's supposed to be like, hey, there is a Titan in the West like there is in Azeroth. Yes, there is. This is not a speculation thing. We know there is. But the other thing is why I say it's minor spoilery, so I won't give anything away here, because... Well, I don't even know that it is a spoiler anymore, because we now should know. Everything is live now. The raid isn't live, but we know what's in the raid. You only have to look through the dungeon journal, or the raid journal, call it what you want, the adventure guide. We know what's coming. And we know what the storyline is, and we know how it ends up. At the same time, some people still consider anything to do with the raid still spoilers, so I won't say anything more than that. But we know everything about Argus from the point of view of the Legion and Titans that we need to. Next comment, a very complimentary one, but I will point to one thing. It says, I like forward to your commentaries, interesting content, well presented, blah, 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 minimal fruity language and zero psychodrama. Don't watch me stream any raids then. Totally different there. I can behave myself on a video. Okay, I'm not going to go off on one on a video because I have time to consider what I'm going to say before I say it. And if I do say something that I don't mean, which doesn't actually happen, but if I did, I could edit it out. Not really going to happen when I'm doing something live, which is, again, the primary reason. It's not the only reason. The primary reason why I stream on Twitch and don't live stream on YouTube, to keep them totally separate. I'm not saying I rage like mad when I'm raiding, but I don't behave myself as well. Next one. So here we go. So this is coming to the Alleria thing again. It says, this is about Alleria being imprisoned by Zero, which we learn about when we go to rescue Zero quite early on in the Argus storyline. So as far as I can tell, Alleria was imprisoned because she either defied orders not to do it, and that's what happened when you disobey direct orders in a military. Bearing in mind, the leader of that military is Thete, not Zero. And or because what she did could have and may in the future easily corrupt her and make her a threat to the rest of her comrades in arms. No, I think it's quite clear that's not the case. I'm not saying this is entirely objective, it is still subjective. It's quite clear now, with everything that has come through, that the reason, because specifically what Alleria said is she was peering into the void. That was it, looking. It's quite clear now that the reason Zero didn't want her doing that was not because she feared any sort of corruption, simply because she didn't want her to see something, that she would have been able to see something that Zero was keeping from Alleria. And I want you to bear something else in mind. The idea of Laura, who is the Naaru at the end of the dungeon, Seat of the Triumvirate, which is a dark Naaru, we're sort of familiar with that concept. We were introduced to that concept in the Burning Crusade, really, with Muru. And we've seen it since as well. So we're okay with that. But Thete is not, bear in mind. So when we're talking about Laura being a dark Naaru, a void Naaru, can't remember what the exact term is, Thete is astounded at this and says that's impossible. A Naaru is the being of the light. To which Velen says, and he is Mr. Light, isn't he? He is the biggest supporter of the Naaru. He basically says to Thete, there is much that Zero did not want you to know. There are aspects. So Zero has clearly been setting the Naaru and him or herself up to be very, very godlike and pure, like no faults or anything like that. So it's quite clear that... So we know that Zero was trying to keep things from them, because Velen said as much, and he's their biggest supporter. I suppose now you'd say apart from Thete. And, you know, so I think that's all there is to it. I think Zero has been trying to keep things from them for whatever reason. But when you're trying to keep something from someone like that, it's not usually a good reason. Right, science time. There were a few comments that got the science teacher in me up. So we're going to get these through. There's 3 of these. So the first one about the idea that, see, it's no biggie to us that Alleria might say she's been off for 1,000 years fighting the Legion. But when Thete says it, he's human. What's this about? And it's 1,000 years from his point of view. So someone said here, the remainder of the Argus story is in blah, blah, blah. As for the time dilation, it's not time dilation. It says that is explained by the twist in Nether. If you actually try to travel between planets that are nowhere near each other, then yes, you will have much longer stretches of time pass from your perspective. No. That's not time dilation. It's the other way around. Time dilation is the idea that you travel very, very quickly. It's got nothing to do with the distance you travel either. It's just the speed you travel. But let's say you were able to travel off to a distant or even a fairly near star and back again in any sort of reasonable amount of time. From your point of view, maybe 20 years have passed. Depending on the speed you've done, you might come back to find 1,000 years has passed. But that's not what's happened here. From our point of view, a few decades has passed. From Theraelian's point of view, 1,000 years has passed. From his frame of reference, he has lived for over 1,000 years. That's the curious thing, and that's got nothing to do with time dilation. That is basically, and the Twisted Nether doesn't explain anything. That's basically a wizard did it, which is fine, by the way. It's a fantasy game. At any point, Blizzard can do whatever they like and say a wizard did it, and it's fine. It's a fantasy game. That's no problem. But it's got nothing to do with time dilation, because it's not time dilation. Next one. Someone just asked at the end here, why is there an E in mathematics? I did respond this at the time, but I do like doing this to my students as well, trying to explain the sort of meaning of words. Not that my ancient Greek and Latin isn't brilliant. I sort of stopped doing that when I was about 13 at school. But I like to sort of talk about this. And the reason is that mathematics comes from the ancient Greek mathema, which means learnt. So, you know, it's just directly from a Greek word. Simple as that. And then this one caught me out. This is where I was talking. This is actually last week's mailbox where I was talking about the margarine and butter thing. For some reason, I don't know why, but someone replied here. We use margarine on our bread instead of butter. It's less fat. They're both pure fat. They're both pure fat. There's not less fat in one than the other. They're different types of fat. But the margarine has the worst types of fat we now know. And it sort of makes sense because people think to themselves, oh, butter, animal fat, saturated fat. But in actual fact, it's not. Because it's got nothing to do with that. Because the link with cholesterol is a bit more complicated. But people sort of think, oh, vegetable oils, things like that, unsaturated fat, better for, yes, but for reasons. But the problem is that also makes them, that's why they're oils. Because they're liquid at room temperature, because of the unsaturated thing, because what it means is one of the fatty acids in it has a double bond, which sort of kinks them up like that, makes it more difficult to sort of gel together and form a solid. But margarine's a solid, so that means you have to do one of two things to make it a solid. You either have to hydrogenate it, look for the words hydrogenated anywhere on your margarine. That basically means they've removed they've saturated it, they've turned it from unsaturated fats to saturated fats to do that. Or they've added in other fats to hold it together. And those other fats are usually trans fats. And that's like the worst thing ever. So, a little bit of science there. So, we'll move on from the science now. Back to the last few comments. So, this is talking about the Netherlight Crucible and this idea that... and I have seen a fair few comments since it's gone live. Most of them not very supportive. And it says, from Blizzard's point of view, they had a PTR up for feedback where people gave feedback regarding the flying debacle, and a forum, blah, 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 which had multiple well-written posts with arguments, comparisons, etc., but they completely ignored it. So this, says to say that they can't make it now because they'd have to rebuild everything from scratch, and this is the flying thing, isn't it, is just lazy. They knew the feedback was there. They knew the backlash it would give, given the history of previous expansion. They completely ignored it and went their own way. As I say, there's two sort of aspects to this, which is why I lump the Netherlight Crucible thing into it as well. From the flying point of view, if they'd have intended, let's say they'd have been of the view that we would like you to be able to carry on flying an Argus, I don't think they could have done Argus. I just think I think you have to appreciate just how much longer it takes to make a fully realised three-dimensional zone compared to a zone that just has to appear three-dimensional. In other words, a sort of topographical map, which in reality is largely two-dimensional and gives the illusion of a fully formed zone, which the current Argus ones are not. It takes a lot more resources, and they simply wouldn't have had them. We have had more new zones in this expansion than ever before, than we've ever had. And, so to turn them, to allow them to fly, it would have... They obviously didn't have the resources for that. So it makes no difference what people want. They simply wouldn't have had the resources to do it. Now, when it comes to feedback in general, the problem is, of course, and this is human nature, this is not a dig specifically about the way Blizzard do things, is if you're looking at something on a forum, the fact of the matter is that when people are discussing something at a PTR stage or an alpha or a beta stage, there are very few people take part in those discussions because there are relatively few people actively engaged in the playtesting of it. And Blizzard can easily dismiss it as a small number of people that are not keen on it. And, they've got millions of players. If 12 people say this is not good, it doesn't matter how well written it is, Blizzard can just think, well, you're like 12 people out of 10 million. Or however many million it is at the moment. So, whereas when it does come live and you get far more, even then they can still, because they've done this before, they can still say, well, anyone who even reads a forum is a really small part of the overall player base. They can instantly dismiss anything, any groundswell of opinion as not representative. And again, it's human nature to do that. If you really believe that something you're doing is correct, then it's easy for you to look at some criticism of it as not representative. So I think you get a lot of that in there as well. Right, on to the next one. This was a comment on a video I did a very long time ago. So, like I seem to have in the last year done multiple SimCraft or simming guides for various things as things have changed. And someone put a comment on this. This is a real occupational hazard with doing any sort of guides on YouTube. Occasionally, someone puts a comment on one, and you think to yourself, "I've done 3 since then. That's way out of date. Please don't watch that." But they're obviously going to, if it comes up in the search, they're going to look at it. But what they've advised here, because I always say never on any sort of sim. It doesn't matter if we're talking about raid bots or simulation craft or anything. Don't import your armory profile into it. Use the simulation craft add-on to get the data, because it says someone's suggesting here, because in that video I was obviously talking about the same sort of thing, not to use the armory. At the time I would have said it because the armory was not updated for Legion. But what they're saying here is if you log out your armory updates, you can log back on, change one item, log off, it will update. Yeah, it didn't at the time, but it does now. But that is still not a reason to use it. Because the armory doesn't work again. Because the armory does not have the Netherlight Crucible traits in it. So if you import your profile from the armory, it won't know what Netherlight Crucible traits you've got. And it also won't realise that your weapon is 15 item levels higher than it really is. It will think, again, all of those Netherlight Crucible crates, including the item level ones, won't be factored in. So don't use the armory at all. It's been basically rubbish all Legion. It's a shame that they didn't develop it in tandem. Right, okay, next one. This is again Netherlight Crucible related, more of a technical one. It says, what happens with 2 or 3 duplicate shadow or light traits? Do you get an increased proc rate? Yes, sort of. There is a benefit in having multiple ones, and they do stack as well, the effects, you'll notice, up to like 3 times. I'm not going to say, let's say Torment the Weak, for example, which is a commonly very good one to have on the shadow side. I'm not going to say that having 3 of those is 3 times as good as having 1 of them, because I can't really know that. But certainly if you have 1 of them, that's not a reason not to take another. It's not that the value drops down massively. If a trait is really good, you would want multiple of them. You can see how good it is. As always with these things, sim it. Always sim it. I'm not saying sims are perfect, but they're the best tool we have to be able to tell these things. But yes, in general, something like Torment the Weak, if you have the option of multiple of them, then generally speaking, unless there's a better combination on the other side, you would want that. And you do benefit from that. Final one, onto the old PvP and PvE realm. So it says, I'm a firm believer that the concept of PvP and PvE realms is a vestigial feature left over from Battlegrounds Vanilla WoW. That being said, I love ganking. I think it is left over from an older way of doing things. I don't necessarily think it's just pre-Battlegrounds. Obviously, when World of Warcraft first came out, Battlegrounds were not a thing. In fact, even I remember when Warsong Gulch came in, and you have to bear in mind when World of Warcraft came out, it was several months. It was about 5 months after it came out in North America that it came out in Europe. So Europe was already 5 months behind. And I didn't play it as soon as it came out in Europe either. I played it a couple of months after that. So it was a good 7 months the game had been out before I even started playing it. And even at that time, Warsong Gulch wasn't a thing. It came out that sort of summer, 2005. So you can see, obviously, without Battlegrounds, and there were no arenas or anything like that then, obviously there would have been no PvP. So absolutely, they had to have like some form of world PvP in there. But I think it's just outdated in general. So these days, we look at modern. I mean, some games are just PvP games, and you understand that when you play it. But I think games now that have like MMOs that have a strong PvE element to them are much less likely to have what I call unconsensual or non-consensual PvP, because that's ultimately what it is. Like if you step into a PvP area, like Elder Scrolls Online, I always go on about, because it has a totally separate PvP and PvE area. It's not the only one, but it's the one that I think does it best nowadays. And so they're totally separate there. But I do think, yeah, there's a lot of now World of Warcraft very old-fashioned features of it, because it's no longer the great innovator. It is, you know, the old gorilla, and we're just waiting for a younger one to come along and knock it off its perch, so to speak. Sorry about the mixed metaphor there, but yeah, there's certain aspects of the game you can sort of feel they don't want to mess about with. Whenever you look at the new features of the game, like there's many new features in Legion, for example, that have not been there before. But when you look at it, you think to yourself, is it really innovative? A lot of it's very new if you only played World of Warcraft, but you do recognise certain things from other MMOs that have been around for a while as well. And Blizzard have just sort of refined them and put them into World of Warcraft. So there's certain things I think about the game that will just never change. And this is one of them. But I mean, my idea has been, like, really recently, is if there were a situation, I said this in the stream, because again I had another comment from last week when I was talking about, was it last week or the week before? Again, you know, I don't like being on a PvP realm, and the attitude is often, well, why did you go into a PvP realm? It's because that's where guilds are. That's where raid guilds are. But I don't choose to go into PvP realm. So if you had a situation where where there was no such realm, no matter how big it was, there was no such thing as a realm that wasn't part of a connected set, even, you know, just had a small one by it. If you had the ability to choose, no matter what guild you want to join, a PvE or a PvP realm, then I would love that, and I'd just join the PvE realm, and then still be able to join the guild that I want to join. That for me would solve the problem. But obviously I don't think it's necessarily a massive problem. I mean, even for me, I just get on with it. Even though Argus, it's not a major inconvenience for me on Argus, because I don't really keep up with my alts a lot. They're the only ones who are in mortal danger on Argus when I do my questing. And on my Death Knight, I just slow myself down by going Blood DK. That way I tend not to be attacked as much. I think I've been attacked once on my Death Knight. Most people tend to steer clear of tanking classes. And no one knows that I ain't got a clue what to do, and I would die instantly if they did attack me. But on my Paladin, of course, I mean, I've been ganked so many times, people just try it on. And I've been killed twice. So I don't particularly feel in danger on there. But again, I think it's one of these things where a lot of people don't. I don't think it's a big enough problem for Blizzard to do anything about it, basically. So anyway, there we go for this week. Thanks very much. Keep the comments coming, and I'll keep doing these each week. If you do want to ask anything directly, remember there's several places you can do that. You could do it on messages here. You can do it on direct messages here. Obviously, if you're a patron, then you ask stuff on Patreon, because those will get priority as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.